Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So I'm Samina from Northeastern. Asim, you want to say hi? Okay, he said hi. Um, he's a man of a few words. So welcome to this SMS PhD chat. Just very quickly, this is a new initiative by the SMS community because we want to have something tailored specifically for doctoral students and to provide value for you because you make up a big part of our society. And this is something specifically launched by Asim, actually, because he is one of the board of directors. So I want to give him a shout out. And he invited me to do this with him. And today we have two very special guests, Louise Morse from Copenhagen Business School. Louise, you want to say hi?
Hi.
And Chris Ryder from University of Michigan.
Hello, everyone.
All right. See, Chris didn't need any cueing. Asim, I don't know. Okay. So just a reminder that today we're going to be talking about job talks and visits. And the first half of this session is recorded. And we're just going to go through a bunch of questions, which you guys submitted. And we'll ask Louise and Chris for their input. And then Asim and I will also chime in. Halfway through, we're going to turn the recording off, and it's going to be an open Q&A session. And there it's, unfiltered, not recorded. And we hope to answer candidly and your questions that you have. All right. So let's get started. And we've had two of these sessions before, and we're going to have a few every few weeks. And so today's session is about job talks and visits. So I thought we'd start with the talk itself specifically and ask Louise and Chris, what are some do's and don'ts for a successful job talk? So Louise, you want to get us started?
Sure, I can do that. All right. Thank you, Samina and Asim, for organizing, and Robin as well from SMS. And thank you very much for inviting me to join here. I'll share some of my experiences based on my experience with job talks. I was part of the recruitment when I was at the London Business School. And then since I joined CBS in 2012, I've also been quite involved with the recruitment there. And I'm also on the recruitment committee this year. And then I've also sat in on job talks at other places where I was before LBS. So do's and don'ts for the job talk. I think there are a few pieces of advice that I always give to students when they think about their job talks. And of course, the first piece of advice is practice, 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 right? So before you go and do a job talk, it's a good idea to practice your talk. Now, of course, you don't want to just sound like you're repeating or reading off a script. But you do want to know what's on your slides. You want to be prepared for different questions. Do ask your fellow students for advice, present in front of them, do present at your home institution. The second thing I often tell people is, don't get defensive. Okay, so you are in a job talk. People will ask you difficult questions. Sometimes there are faculty who are rude or insecure. They want to show off their own knowledge and they ask you nasty questions. Very often, faculty are just trying to see how you'll handle a tough question, or they want to test you a bit, or they're curious about your research. But it's okay to say, look, I don't know the answer to that question, or can I get back to you, or I need to think about it a little bit. Of course, it's not great if you say that to all the questions. So that's why practice, practice, practice. But it's important not to get defensive, because that is a little bit of a test. That's also a bad thing to, if that happens in a classroom, then you get into an argument with people, and that's never a good idea in a job talk. I think another thing I wrote down was keep control of the talk. So often when I see students present, they end up, you want to answer all the questions. And so if someone asks a question or they ask you to go to the end of the talk, you lose track of where you were going. And then you lose control of your own talk. And then the audience takes control of where you're going, if you're going to be able to get through your slides. So you sort of have to find the right balance between answering questions, listening to the audience, but at the same time, not letting them take over it again. So it's okay to say, look, can I get back to that question when I get to the end? Or I'm going to talk about that when I get to the results. So you don't want to dismiss people, but keep control of your own talk. That's also showing the audience that you would do okay in a classroom. And then I think the last thing I would say, and then I'll turn it over to Chris, is, look, it's okay to be nervous. We expect you to be nervous. If you go in and do a job talk, if you are nervous, take a deep breath, take a glass of water or something, or acknowledge to the audience, look, I'm a bit nervous. That's okay. We expect that. Yeah, so I have other things, but I'll let Chris say something on this topic.
Thanks, Louise. Chris?
Okay, yeah, I think I would largely echo much of what Louisa just said. First, I have to apologize. Something is printing in the background here, and I can't seem to get it stopped. Shared office space at home. So I'm sure this happens to you too. All right, so to build on a few things that Louisa mentioned, I would totally agree with practice, 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 and don't be defensive. What I would say to I think is most important is that the job talk is not just an opportunity to present your paper and show people how smart you are and how rigorous you've been, but it's really an opportunity to connect to the audience. And to do that, I would encourage you to take opportunities to go off script when it seems like the audience wants to engage a little bit deeper on something that you'd planned, even if you're not prepared for it. I think, we get questions that I think, like Louisa said, I'm perfectly happy to say, gee, I don't know. Here's how I start to think about that. I don't think I can get a good answer today. But I share my thought process, and I think in doing that, you engage the audience, and oftentimes you get better suggestions from them. Recognizing that, the job market paper is not a finished product when you're giving the job talk. It's still work in progress, and you want to take advantage of those opportunities, not just to make it better, but as a chance to engage people who might be your future colleagues. So do go off script and take advantage of those opportunities and recognize them as opportunities. So I think that, when you get these tough questions, demonstrating how you might get to a better answer is a nice way of showing that you're a scholar beyond your paper, that you have ways of doing this that maybe, the best way to do that would be to do some follow-up interviews or to run an experiment that you haven't done yet or you haven't designed before. But that can demonstrate that you do have additional ideas or can generate additional ideas beyond your paper. Which is important. I say, and oftentimes faculty need to be reminded of this, that we hire people, not papers. It's important to demonstrate that, we are people and we are scholars and we are much more than just the paper we're presenting. I completely agree with Louisa that it's important to stay on time. And, I remember giving a job talk as a rookie, and I was having a hard time controlling a very vocal crowd. And finally, I just said, all right, I'm just going to move ahead because I'm not going to be the guy who came here and couldn't get to results in his job talk. And I understand that you want to talk about this and you want to talk about this. And I am going to follow up with each of you afterwards. And I did. And I think so. It's totally okay to say, I really want to talk about this. I really want to discuss the results, or I really want to get to this. I will follow up, and then you deliver, and that's fine. Two things that don't do, like Louisa already said, don't be defensive. It's work in progress. This is an opportunity to make it better. And if you treat it as such, you'll present yourself as someone that they're really going to enjoy having around the hallways and engaging in conversations. And the last, maybe the most important is do not expect to be perfect. You're going to rehearse and practice, and it's not going to go exactly as you planned, and that's totally okay. Really, I think what it took me a long time to realize, I got so nervous presenting that finally I just had to shut down all the rehearsals and say, I'm done. I'm just going to go and be me. And that was probably the smartest thing I could have done. Because I was just building up too high expectations. And I realized, afterwards that those things that I thought I had done wrong, people enjoyed that conversation. Or it was an opportunity. I got better ideas for my paper from that. And so, not to have low expectations, but don't have overly high ones, and recognize that what you might see as a flaw as a presenter is actually an opportunity as a scholar.
Asim, you want to chime in?
Okay, so that ends my reputation for being a man of few words. But anyway, I think, Chris and Louisa pretty much covered most things that would have said. I want to reiterate Chris's point about we don't hire papers, we hire people, right? So, and I think the corollary to that is your goal here is not to shut down all conversation. Your goal is to actually make conversation happen, right? So I see a lot of job talks where people feel like, oh, if I manage to sort of kill that person's question as aggressively as possible, and they never ask me another question, that's success. It's not. If you get to a point where nobody's asking you any question, you're done. Like, you're not getting that job, right? Because it basically says, okay, this person's too idiot or too stubborn for me to bother engaging with this, and I would never hire this person, right? So you're much better off engaging with the question and saying, okay, let me think about that. What would you suggest? Or often, you don't, it's okay if you don't get the point of the question in the first go. You can sort of ask for clarification, and that's just saying you're an engaged scholar who's actually interested in the idea and not just trying to go through the motions. And I think the other point is, I totally second Luis's point about managing questions and managing time. But I think where I see people slip up a lot is you say, let me get back to that question, when I get to my results, and then you don't, right? And then I asked you a question in the first 5 minutes, and then you get to the point where you should be answering it. So you want to, and I mean, I frankly, I've seen some people do this. It's fine to actually put it on the board or put it on a piece of paper and say, I'm going to come back to this. But if you say you're going to get back to me on something, I expect you to get back to me, right? So yes, you should manage time, but that's not an excuse to say, aha, now I've said I'll get back to it later and I can just ignore you, right? So if people have asked you a question and they're interested, try to get back to them. And as Chris said, if you can't manage to do that in the presentation, do it in the 101, do it afterwards, reach out to people, but just make sure you do actually get back to people if they had a question, right? And I think that's pretty much. Samina, did you want to add something as well?
I'll add 2-3 quick things. All three speakers have mentioned, you want to be curious, right? The other piece I'm going to add is you want to have energy and enthusiasm. So something that kills a talk right away is someone who's tired. So, you might have flown really far to get to this job talk. Take whatever caffeine you need, get a good night's rest. But if you're not enthusiastic about your research at that job talk, why would anybody else be, right? So I've seen job talks fall flat only because the presenter didn't seem energized, all right? So that's definitely one. The second is building on Chris's and Asim's point also about answering questions. Sometimes people don't ask questions very well. And so feel free to shoot it back at them, right? So when in doubt, ask them a question. Like you could say, this is what I'm hearing your question is that correct? Or could you restate your question? Feel free to do that because sometimes another colleague in the room will restate the question for the original person in a better way or help you out. So, the audience, if they invited you for a job talk, they're interested in you. So there are some people in that room who are definitely, your fans and want you to do well. The last part I'll say is it really is a wonderful opportunity. So don't be kind of scared and nervous. Think of it instead as, hey, I have a captive audience, and this is a great time for me to share my work with them. And when else do you really get that, right? At a lot of our conferences, people are kind of scattered and you only have 20 minutes. You get a deep dive on your research with a captive group of scholars who are interested in your work. So think of it, I think if you change your framing in your head of what the opportunity is, it doesn't make you as nervous and as fearful. And instead, it solicits kind of curiosity, engagement, and all the things about scholarship that we actually want to support. So, all right, let's dive on to question 2.
Yeah, so I think the other, actually from the questions that you folks submitted, I think the theme that came out was more than the job talk, you seem to be nervous about the one-on-ones. So figure we should probably, which I understand, right? Because the job talk you can practice, but the one-on-ones you really can't. And so I guess let's start with the general question. I know there were some specific things that people wanted to know how to handle, but let's start with the general topic of what do you do in this half an hour? Or sometimes, I mean, I've been to schools where it's been 45 minutes. What do you do with this one-on-one time? And let's start with Chris this time, since just to keep things balanced. Chris?
Okay, yeah, I'll try and, this is something I still am trying to figure out. Right, you go and give seminars, and sometimes you struggle to make conversation in the one-on-ones, no matter how much you prepare and read other people's work, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that, being on both sides of that conversation, I think it's totally okay if it's a little awkward. And you don't have to worry too much about like choosing the right topics or being charming or anything like that. I think what really matters is that we've made the effort to try to have a conversation, and people appreciate that. I would say it's a pretty low rate of like great one-on-ones where you really click with someone and have an interesting conversation you want to follow up with, and that's totally okay. I would suggest the following to prepare. One, do look at someone's work. It is pretty obvious when someone is just saying, oh, so you're an editor at SMJ, right? Or you wrote a paper about this, and that's like, okay, they glanced at my CV and, okay, they just want to make conversation. That's fine. All right. But then want to have a conversation about whatever that leads to. Okay. I think what you're demonstrating there is that, like, you can go have coffee or if you're the only two people in the office that day and you go get lunch, it won't be painful for either one of you because you'll both try. That's really the bar that I think it is in a one-on-one. The one thing that I would say you don't want to do is represent your paper. This is probably the mistake. I find many job candidates come in and they're still on script. And every question you want to ask or talk about the paper, it's right back to the paper. I did like all these robustness checks, and they're still trying to sell you on the result. When really what you want to do is kind of have a conversation about the research agenda. And for me, the weaknesses of the paper are directions for future research that you may or not want to do, or maybe you want to engage our doctoral students or your colleagues in. So the main thing is to let the conversation flow, where the goal is to demonstrate, hey, I'd be a great colleague. I'm interested in having you as a colleague, as opposed to let me represent my paper or stick to my agenda, because these are the 5 points I wanted to make when I came in.
Luis?
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Do ask for the schedule in advance and know who you're meeting with. You'd be surprised how many people I've met and they don't know who they're meeting with. And then there's some sort of, well, I've had so many job talks, so I don't quite remember who you are. That's just not, I would even say it's okay if you have a piece of paper with you with the schedule and you've made a few notes. So I'm meeting with Louise Morse and she does research on this. And oh, by the way, I looked at that paper and that was interesting. So I think, just to follow up on that point from Chris, I think that's really important. Know who you're meeting with. And then just try and be yourself. As Chris said, we want to know, are you someone that perhaps I could work with, right? Do we have common interests research-wise? But even if we don't have common research interests, then I'd like to know, I'm going to end up sitting next to you at the lunch table, or we might have a department dinner or a research seminar. Am I going to enjoy spending time with you as a colleague? Or hopefully at some point when we are going to be back in the office. But I think, as Chris said, we just want to know, do we think that you would fit in? And, I often tell people, don't accept a job talk at a school that you never, ever would consider going to. Because then the conversations, especially in the one-on-ones, are just going to be so much harder, right? So the job talk you can think of as a practice, and you can learn a lot of things we just talked about. But the one-on-ones, you will talk about research, but there will be conversations too about what's life like in the department, what's your motivation for coming here. So I think all of those things are really difficult if you're at a place that you really don't want to be, because it's sort of there is some matchmaking, and you're making a selection too, right? Are these people I would like to be in an office with?
Amina, did you want to add something?
So I think a great default, if everything else dries up in conversation, is to ask them what they're currently working on. So this is stuff that isn't published yet. This is the stuff scholars are usually the most excited about, which are their current projects. And so if you have nothing else to say, let them do the talking and throw the question to them. Again, you see this is my standard, strategy, but really people get excited about talking about their current research projects. And so, they want to see curiosity and engagement. And that's a great way to, draw out from the person you're meeting with, even if you don't really remember exactly what they're working on in detail, talk about something that's current. And that'll usually get that person excited and hopefully show you're curious and engaged.
Yeah, and I would just build on that and say, the one-on-ones doesn't mean, I think a lot of people act as though they're participants on the quiz show when they come to these one-on-ones with me, where it's like they just sit there waiting for the next question and they hit the buzzer and then they try to answer it. And that's not the idea, right? It's meant to be a conversation. So, in fact, when people come to, now I'm destroying my own strategy, but by revealing it, but that's just information economics view. But when people come and ask for one-on-ones in Minnesota, my first question is, what questions do you have for me, right? Because I want to know what you want to know about the school, and because whatever questions I have about you, I've already seen your job talk, it's fine. Right. And so, and you'd be surprised by how many people have no questions about the school that they're supposedly looking for a job at. And I find that bewildering. How can you not want to know something about the school, right? Right. And I don't mean, and I know there were a couple of questions about this, I don't mean questions specifically about you, right? So, I would actually recommend staying away from, okay, if you hire me, then, where can I live and what can I teach and whatever, right? That's a conversation for further down the road. You don't want to be presumptuous and assume they're going to hire you, because sometimes it's really awkward where it's like, yeah, after your job talk, there's no way we would hire you anyway. So I don't know why you're asking me this question. But general questions about, what's the direction of the department, what is the, if you've done your homework, something about some of the recent changes. Especially if you're talking to the more recent hires, you can ask questions about what their experience has been like, what do they teach, right? What's the size of the undergraduate program versus the MBA program? This is all stuff that actually matters to you if you choose to take a job somewhere, or questions about the city, questions about, lifestyle. Those are all perfectly fine, right? It's very hard if you don't have any questions about the department or the school or the community. I have to conclude you're not interested in the job. And that's not a good sign, right? So just be kind of prepared, not only to sort of engage with people and engage with their research. And I strongly second Samina's point about asking people what they're working on, right? Because, the other thing you don't want to do, especially with senior people, is you don't want to look at their first ever paper and then say, oh, I studied this paper 20 years ago. And I thought it was really fascinating. It's like, yeah, that was 20 years ago. I've moved on. I don't care about corporate strategy anymore. I do, by the way. But, I'm so sick of that stuff. And you're still asking me about it. And now I have to go back and think about what I was doing 20 years ago. Don't do that, right? So if you are going to look at their published work, look at their most recent publications and remember that, if you remember nothing else. Or look for something that actually connects with what you're doing. But, but beyond that, just kind of think about the school. And then the last thing I'll say is, I think I want to emphasize that in this process, everybody matters, right? So, I see every now and then we get people coming through here who seem to be under the impression that as long as they can make the really senior people happy, it doesn't really matter what happens with. So I don't have to be nice to the assistants because they don't really matter. I don't have to be nice to the PhD students because they don't really matter. I don't have to be nice to the administrator because she or he doesn't really matter. That is so not true. Okay, any interaction you have that goes badly or where will get back to the people who are hiring you and will reflect poorly on you. And in fact, you come across as the kind of person, I am not going to name names obviously, but I can think of candidates where it's the senior people go all wow, she was so charming and she was so great, and the junior people are all looking at she had no idea who we were and she didn't bother to talk to us. That's a serious red flag, right? Because it's basically saying, you're not going to make a great colleague to us. You're just going to be a suck up to the senior faculty. That's not, we're not going to hire you, right? And as I'm not a senior person, but the senior people in the department also would not want to hire someone like that, because it's like, well, that's not the kind of person we're looking for, right? So, you don't have to make a super great impression. You're not trying to get these people to marry you. You're just trying to leave a sort of reasonably positive impression with them. But you want to have a positive interaction with everyone, and not just kind of say, oh, I want to prioritize the person I happen to think is the most important person in the room, right? Okay, so I know there were a couple of more specific questions. Samina, do you want to dive into those? Or?
Sure. I think this is an interesting one that folks brought up is, when, if ever, should you bring up personal situations? So things like dual career, geographic constraints, are these things to bring up or not? Louise, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I was in another session giving advice to PhDs recently, and someone said, look, if you can't bring up those with the person that you're in the interview with, then is that really a place where you want to go? Right? Because they're going to find out at some point. So you don't want to, it's happened to me that women come and ask about maternity leave, and that's the only question they have for me. So that's not great, right? And if that's the only question you have for a female faculty member. But it doesn't mean that you can't ask about it, right? So if you are, at some point I'm considering having a family, and at least in Denmark, it's considered to be okay that you would ask about questions like that. And I have to say, Aseem, I generally agree with everything you say, but the sort of advice on not talking about where to live, we are looking at those things. And I want people to be interested in the research environment. I want them to be interested in the department to show that they are motivated and thinking about what kind of school we are. But I'm also, because of our location, interested in people having thought a little bit about, even if they've never been to Denmark, what's the implication of moving here? Otherwise, I'm going to think there's no way they're ever going to move to Denmark. It's far away from everywhere else, except for maybe the other Scandinavian countries. But I do think if you have personal constraints, right? If you're a dual career couple, I think that was the example that you gave, or if you're thinking about other things with personal constraints, I think it's okay to ask about them. I don't think it should be the only or the first question you ask. I think you want to engage with research before you get to those questions. But I think if you have issues like that, that's, yeah. But Chris may have different thoughts on this question.
Chris?
Yeah, this is a hard one. I thought a lot about it, and I'm afraid I don't have really great advice on this one. I think, a few things I've thought about it is, one, the norms or the laws that govern these kind of conversations vary dramatically across institutions and geographic contexts. And so I would say, know the norms. For example, in Michigan, we're not allowed to discuss. It would be illegal if we were to discuss, say, dual career situations, or say that, while their partner was willing to work in Detroit, or has a job offer in Detroit or something like that. That said, I know that there are places that does enter the conversation. And so this is tough, because individually it could be advantageous if it makes you a more appealing candidate at the margin at a place individually. I also think that, in the aggregate, it's not necessarily good for the field if we do this collectively. I guess, so I don't know what I would say. I tend to not bring up these conversations unless, one, I'm asked, or two, I'm talking to a place that it would be really weird for me to move there unless there was some other reason, or for me to come and work there unless there was some other reason. And I think that, to the extent you're on the fence, when it would be sort of a weird or idiosyncratic match factor, I think it does make sense to demonstrate that you're serious about moving there. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, just to be clear, Chris, I would never ask about a candidate's personal situation. But if they ask me a question, then I am allowed to answer it, and I would answer it. but I wouldn't necessarily share that information with anyone else, right?
Asim?
I mean, I would say, so I mean, I've never been in the position of having to ask any of these things because I'll move anywhere pretty much. But as long as it has an orchestra. I would say the rule of thumb I would use is, is this something that really impacts your decision in terms of where you want to join, right? So, and I mean, just to clarify, I think Louise's point, I actually, I think Minnesota, we have the same thing. Like, it's kind of a different country, and it's actually almost a Scandinavian country. So, so we do sort of look at whether people actually want to move there, but I think what I had in mind was more, sometimes people get into sort of very nitty gritty levels of detail, saying like, oh, so, what kind of insurance plan do you have? And like, what kind of, when you relocate, what's the budget for relocation? It's like, really, are you really going to make a decision about whether you want to join here based on that, right? So you're asking me a question, if it's really critical to your decision on whether, if it's important information to you at this stage, right? Because you're at a stage, you're trying to decide whether you want to join this place or not. And we're trying to decide whether we want to hire you or not. If it's important information for that, then go ahead and ask. If it's not important and it can wait until after you've kind of made a decision, wait, right? There's no reason to get into like details that are not, you may not get to that stage. Or frankly, the modal outcome is you're not going to get to that stage. And then I think also the other thing I'll say is I think you want to think about who you're talking to a little bit, right? So, I mean, typically I would say most one-on-ones, you often end up having a conversation with the department chair. You almost always have somebody from the dean's office that you'll kind of get to. And there's some questions that might be more appropriate to ask like a department chair than to ask, like, you don't have to ask every single person, like, what do you, right? So, so maybe you want to think about where the conversation is, what kind of conversation you're having. And I think the broader point is you want to be able to, part of what we're assessing here is your ability to read cues about what people want to talk about. So different people will give you very clear indications of, right? When I was in the job market, I've had people who said, I want to spend the next 30 minutes telling you everything that's wrong with your job market paper, right? That's fine. If that's what you really want to do, I go through that, right? I have other people who said, hey, let's just talk about, I see you write poetry. Tell me about like your favorite, like that's what I want to talk about. Okay, fine, right? So you need to let the person who is in the room set the agenda. But if they open up the space for you to say, what questions do you have about the city, whatever, like someone like me would do, that's an opportunity for you to ask some of those questions that might be on the top of your mind, right? And you can have that conversation.
So my take on this is, the school is hiring you to be a colleague. So they're hiring you as a scholar and for your scholarship. So I would kind of go in a bit agnostic in the sense of, we all have different situations. Some of us are parents, some are not. Some are married, some are not. Some have dual career issues, some do not. They're hiring you or going to offer you a job irrespective of those things. So you can show enthusiasm for the location, things like that, if hopefully you feel them. But I don't think you have to state any personal situations. Like Louise said, if you're curious and you want to ask about certain things, of course, you can bring it up. But I don't think you should feel that you have to disclose any of that. Once you have an offer, then if there's specific questions you want to ask, I feel like that's a more appropriate time to do that. At the initial talk and visit, I think, you don't need to bring any of that to the table necessarily, because they should be judging you. And just so that people aren't biased in any way. There's positive and negative biases. So present yourself for the scholar that you are, and maybe get to those personal questions if they're important to you to be answered once you get the offer, and if you get the offer.
Okay, so some of the other things that some of you raised, and maybe we'll try and go through this a little bit more quickly because I'm mindful of time. So I think one classic chestnut is the one about what are you looking for in a school or department, or why this, or the variant being why this school or why this department, right? And I think a lot of people, several of you said, how do you answer that? Because you don't know as much about the department or the school, and as the person asking you the question. So thoughts, tips on how to deal with those, that whole line of kind of questioning, saying, tell me why you want to come here, kind of. And either Luis, you want to take that? Chris, you want to take that? I'm going to mentally toss a coin and say Luis.
Okay. No. So again, I think be honest, right? And also know where you're applying, because if I ask a candidate that and I get sort of a standard answer, which is, oh, CBS is a great school and you have a great department and there are some great people doing great research, that doesn't tell me anything about your motivation or why should we hire you and not the other candidate that I'm going to meet with tomorrow. So I do think, give an answer that's a little bit thought through. Maybe there are 2 people in that department that they have research that really works well with your research agenda. You've had conversations with them and you would love to learn from them, or you'd love to work with them. Maybe there's a certain data set that's available. We get that a lot. In Denmark, we have access to some great data on the Danish population. So a lot of people are interested in that data. That's fine. That can become a standard answer, but it's still, it's some sort of motivation that's related to how we are different from other schools. And so there are things you can, Asim is right. You can't know everything about the place where you're applying, but there are things you can find out. You can also talk to people at your home institution, right? So I'm going to apply to Minnesota. I know Asim. Has he maybe told you a little bit about the school? Are there things that could be great if I were to get a job offer there? Are things that I should ask about that could be concerning or that could be advantages? So you can find out information about the place that you're going to. So I think I'll try and be honest and give a little more nuanced answer than just sort of a very standard, it looks like a great place. But think about who you might work with and why is it that you want to go there. And I have to say, again, being in Europe, it's not just moving to Europe, right? In Denmark, if you end up having family, you put your kids in school, they're going to speak Danish. It's a different language because there's still most people speak English. So there are some things that are, it's a big move for many people who come to Copenhagen Business School. And so I think having considered a little bit about what the location means and what would you think about moving to Europe if you're coming from a school in the US is important.
Chris, do you want to add?
Yeah, I agree with much of that. I think my approach to handling that, and this is a little bit of echo, but maybe a little bit extending the thought, is that, well, let me first start. My belief is that I want to go take a job where people want me to come work there because of who I am and who I'm going to be. And so I want to try and project my aspirations for the scholar and the colleague I'm going to be there. And if that doesn't resonate with them, I'd rather know sooner than later. So in these kinds of conversations, I would be kind of aspirational and saying, all right, here's what I think would be great about working here. If I were to come here, I had a great talk with the doctoral students at breakfast this morning. I could see myself working with some of these doctoral students. I'd like to be a committee member on some of these committees. Probably maybe not chair, at the beginning of my career, because, I want to get my papers out, and I don't really know that I have, 2 years removed from a doctoral program, great advice for advising doctoral students just yet. Or, I could see myself developing an elective on this course that is based a lot on the research that I'm doing. It's work that I've done. I'd be really excited about that. And if the school values electives, then I'd love to do that. Or if it's, this is a school that has a big undergrad program and they like to kind of train faculty up and give those preps that then say, I want to teach undergrads. But I think the key is to, what would excite you about working there? And how is that different than sort of the standard answer you'd give everywhere you go about your research agenda for the next 3 years and who you want to become as a scholar, and basically laying out your plan to get tenure. So making it custom to the group, but also ways in which you think you could distinctly contribute in ways that would make you happy, and see how that resonates. And you'll know from the reaction. People kind of wince if you say something like, "Oh yeah, we don't like, junior faculty to get involved in exec ed," or, "Oh yeah, we don't. The core is already taught by them. We need electives," right? You'll get the sense of how much your aspirations fit with their needs.
Amina?
I'm glad Chris brought up teaching, because I think what we often forget in our job talks and visits is there's a very other pragmatic reason that the school is hiring you, which is they have needs of classes getting filled. So, you don't want to go in saying, I don't teach this or I do teach this. You want to go in more with, yeah, I think I could see myself teaching this. I'd be open to developing an elective, or, if I had my dream elective, this is what it would be. And they might come back with, well, we really need people to teach this core class. But it's just showing, again, you're sharing information and gathering information. So you don't want to seem too bounded or rigid, in that sense. But do answer those questions candidly, because it might also help the chair of the department think of potential new classes that the school could offer, or how you will fit. Like Chris mentioned, what are your aspirations and will you fit well in that school? Teaching is as big a part of this as research.
Yeah, and I know we had some questions about since we're already talking about it, we had some questions about teaching as well. So I mean, again, I would second Samina's point about, I think it's fine if you have a particular preference, saying, here's what I would most like to teach, or here's what I feel most comfortable teaching. Hopefully you've taught something, in your already. At the same time, you don't want to make it sound like that's the only thing you're willing to teach, because obviously, both because you don't know what teaching needs they have, but also because we're hiring you as a person. We need to know that you can teach more than one thing. The other thing I would say is, and I mean, I agree with everything Luis and Chris said. One of my things when I was in the job market was to take a close look at the profiles of the recent hires, right? And just look at, what kind of, who had they hired in the last few years? What were they teaching, which you could always tell from their websites for the most part. And just get a sense of, even if I wasn't meeting with those people, and usually you were, but even if I wasn't meeting with those people, because I think one of the things that, and this is not just a talking point, I think it's genuinely true. I think one of the things that really matter if you're an assistant professor is having a community of other people at your stage to work with, right? So to me, a big part of the draw for a lot of places that I applied was, you have such a great group of junior assistants, and I could totally see myself working with them, or you have a group of assistants who seem to be doing really well, right? Clearly you guys are doing something well to develop your junior faculty, right? And that's really important to me, because, at the end of the day, I want to have a career and I want to be at a place that is good to junior faculty. And I think that, and the nice thing about that is, even if it's not completely true, no junior faculty member is going to say, no, actually, like, we are terribly unproductive and this place sucks, right? Hopefully. If they do, then you've really learned something. And no senior person is going to say, no, we really hate our junior faculty, and right? So it's an answer that you really can't go wrong with in some sense, right? Of course, if you're interviewing at Dartmouth and they have no junior faculty, you may not want to say this, but in general, I think it's good to know what recent hires look like and what they've done, and because I think that's information that is genuinely useful to you, but it can also be a starting point for a conversation. Okay, so I think the other, I think Luis, you've already sort of mentioned this a couple of times, so maybe we should just go into that right now. One of the other questions that came up a lot in several different sort of versions was about kind of these differences between hiring in different geographies, right? So Europe versus North America, how does the market look the same? How does it look different? And I think there was a question about Asia. There was a question about, Australia, although I'm not sure anyone on this call is actually qualified to handle that one. But it's, I mean, you know, so Luis, I mean, you were talking a little bit about kind of Denmark and Europe, and I know you I mean, even from your experience at LBS, thoughts on how the job market is different in Europe versus in North America?
Yeah, so I think at the top schools in Europe, the job market works very much like it does at the top US schools. But again, there is a consideration that, you know, there's a different market in some sense. Sometimes the job market runs a little bit earlier than the US job market. Some of the schools that are not the top schools may have a difficult time competing for the best candidates. And so there's a consideration both with these people be willing to not live in the US, but also can we attract them? And so we think about, when we're thinking about the job market, and that was true even at LBS, right? How do we attract these people to come live in London, which is a very expensive city? And I guess now with Brexit, that would, you know, but yeah, that's their consideration. But there is a consideration of, you know, people willing to move. There, you know, it's not all schools that do flyouts. Some of them only do interviews. It's actually, I think it was just after I arrived at Copenhagen Business School that we started to do standard flyouts with seminars. Before that, it was an interview, but there wasn't. You didn't come and present your paper. So some schools may differ in how they deal with those things. Some European schools rely very much on the faculty raising their own research funding. So those are things you definitely want to ask about in meetings with European schools. How much am I expected to spend my time applying for research funding? Or how does it work with research funding at your school? So those are things that become more pertinent at European schools. And then there are many other things that we could talk about specifically about Europe, but that would also differ from European country to European country. And I can't comment at all on the schools in Asia or Australia. I think Asim is right. We might need someone else on the panel.
Chris, did you want to?
I don't have a
vast knowledge of Asian schools
to say. I mean, I have given job talks in both Europe and Asia, and consider moving there at different points. And I think that there might be as much variation beyond the factors that Louise already mentioned about timing and considerations and structure. There might be more variation across institutions than there is necessarily about geography. And so I would say that, you know, best bet is, if you are targeted in a geographic area, to really get to know what the timing of the market is and how it differs from those who have been on it or working in that place. But if it's, you know, specific to a school, you want to talk about people who have been to that institution or worked at that institution, because there's all sorts of institutional idiosyncrasies that I think might actually be more determinant of outcomes than geography.
Asim, can I just add one thing to some of the things that you said before? I'm going to do that, then you'll have to interrupt me if you don't want me to. Because I think Asim's advice on when you go to meetings, and you know, you shouldn't think about only wanting to impress the senior people, and also thinking about who are the recent junior hires, because those are the people that you likely are going to hang out a lot with, learn from, ask questions of, you know, how do we do these things? I think that's really important advice. And I think one of the best pieces of advice I got from my advisor when I was at MIT was, you know, every talk is a job talk. And that also, you know, that also goes for conversations. And it goes for, you know, you have a conversation with me, come do a job talk at CBS. I might talk to Samina, and Samina might say, oh, did you meet with that candidate? Well, you know, we're not really supposed to talk about them, but, you know, we do have conversations through the network of, you know, what did you think? Who were the strong candidates in the market this year? People will ask me about who are the PhD students at CBS who have impressed you, right? And that comes from talks you give at your own department, at your own institution. Now, of course, we expect that PhD students develop over time, but it just means that, you know, you make an impression during your time as a PhD on the faculty in your own department, and then when you go and do job talks at different places. So I'm not saying that to make you nervous about every interaction you have, because we all understand that you're individuals and you develop. But I think, some of the advice that Chris gave on, show curiosity, be passionate about your research, as Samina said, right? Those all, we want to know you as a person, as a researcher, and understand how you work. We hire the person and the scholar